Hi, I'm Larry Richardson and welcome to Zeniors.com Cooking. In this video session we're going to make chicken soup from scratch. Now this is a 2-day process. It's a little bit involved, but it's a lot of fun, and boy is the payoff delicious. What we do is we do it over 2 days. The first day we make the chicken broth. The second day we make the soup itself. Why does it take 2 days? Because we have to take the broth that we make the first day, put it into the refrigerator, and allow the chicken fat to rise to the top. The second day, we scrape the chicken fat off, and then we make the actual soup itself. If you do not want to do the 2-day version, I do have a quick and easy version that I include with the chicken soup recipe that's available on Zeniors.com. So if you visit Zeniors.com and you put the words chicken soup in the search window, then the recipe will come up both for the 2-day version and the quick and easy version. But for this video, I'm really going to focus on making it using the more involved 2-day version. So come on, let's get started. To make the broth, remove the neck and giblet pack from the chicken cavity and the thermometer from the exterior and discard. Add 7 quarts of water to the 12-quart soup pot and turn the stove on high. Chop 1 carrot, 1 celery stalk, and 1 onion into chunks and add to the water along with a crushed head of garlic. Place the chicken in the pot, cover, and bring to a boil. Then lower the heat to medium and slow boil for 1.5 hours. At this point, carefully remove the chicken from the broth. Break it up with tongs if you have to. Pick the meat off the bones and discard the skin. Place the meat in a container and refrigerate. Put the bones back in the broth. Add 1 cap of white vinegar to the broth. This will help the fat to separate out. Boil the broth with the bones in it for 20 minutes. When done, place a colander in another pan or container that can take the heat and strain the broth to remove the vegetables, bones, and other particulates. Slowly pour the broth or ladle it out of the first pan and into the strainer over the second. Cool the broth container by placing it in a sink of cold water with ice. When it's cool enough, put it in the refrigerator and allow the fat to separate out overnight. Do not make the soup until the fat is separated out, or you will suffer intestinal distress. Take the broth that is cooled overnight out of the refrigerator. Set it in the sink with a plastic trash bag beside it. Use a spoon to carefully remove all the fat that has floated to the top. Place the broth pan on the stove at high heat and bring it to a boil. While we're getting the broth to come to a boil, what we want to do is prepare the other ingredients that we'll use in the soup. Now I prefer to use a good green scallion, first of all, then 2 zucchinis, about medium size, 4 carrots, 4 celery stalks, and 1 medium onion. And we're going to chop this really fine, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. The other thing we're going to use is the chicken that we prepared yesterday and picked off of the bones. And then we have to decide which type of pasta or rice we're going to use. If you're going to use a good brown rice, a lot of these take up to an hour to prepare. So what I recommend is that you prepare this ahead of time and then you add it to the soup as you need to. The noodles themselves, they only take about 8 to 10 minutes to prepare, so they can be made in the soup itself. What I recommend with both of these is that you're very sparing in the amount that you use. The reason for that is that when you add these to a soup, they tend to drink up a lot of the broth. And you'll be really amazed. You'll add some of it at the very start of the soup, and the next day you'll get up, and these will have drunk all of the broth. So be really sparing, really experiment with it, and see how much you like to use, and then, write that down, and that's the way to do it in the future. So let's get started with the vegetables. When preparing the vegetables to add to the soup, there is actually an order to follow. And the reason for that is that carrots take a lot longer than celery and zucchini to cook in the soup. And the onions, we want them to cook down. So these are the first vegetables we're going to add to the broth. So here's what we do. We're going to cut the onion very fine because this is really a flavor enhancer. We're not turning to the onion for any kind of texture. So we just slice this into tiny pieces. Of course, we have to remove the paper first, because no one wants to have this in their soup. Okay. Be really careful when you're working with these sharp knives. So I'm cutting it into very tiny cubes. Okay, so there's our onions. We'll put those in the soup with the carrots in a moment. And the carrots themselves, certainly rinse them off, give them a good scrub. Some people may even want to peel them if they're concerned about pesticides. And the carrots we're just going to slice into, I'd say about 1/8 of an inch thick pieces. And you're more than welcome to add more carrot, more celery, less celery, more of any of these ingredients to your taste. What I recommend is that you try the recipe as written the first time, and then you decide what you want to do differently as you go on with it. And I'd certainly like to hear on Zeniers.com how you made it and what you did to make it better. That's always interesting to me, because really no recipe is set in stone. It might be set in ink, but it's not set in stone, and you can pretty much do whatever you want with any recipe. I have a lot of fun taking recipes that ask for a lot of oil and butter and other bad ingredients and eliminating those and finding other ways to ramp up the flavor. Often the answer to that question is to add a lot more spices, exotic spices. And certainly in this case with the chicken soup, we're kind of sticking to a more traditional design, so we're not really adding a lot of exotic spices, but you can still add more onion, more garlic, more celery, just any of these ingredients. Whatever you want to do to your taste, do it. It's not written in stone. And if you want to take it in a completely different direction, go ahead. But I think that the basic vegetable or the basic chicken soup stock is delicious, and it's usable in any way you want. So now I'll get these carrots all cut up. So now we have the onions and the carrots ready to go in the soup. And what we'll do is we'll keep the soup on kind of a slow boil, and we'll let these cook for about 10 minutes before we add the other vegetables. That will give the carrots time to soften up. If you like your carrots really soft, maybe give them 15 minutes, but I always find about 10 minutes is right. And then I'll add the celery, the zucchini, and the scallions. So let's move forward from there. Okay, there's our broth in a very slow boil. I can even turn it down a little bit from there. And I'm going to add the onions and the carrots. Now when you add these vegetables, be careful about splashback. If you really don't feel comfortable scraping these off into the soup, into the broth, then use a spoon. Put the ingredients on a spoon and lower them into it, because soup burns do hurt. So there we go. And I'll cover that back up. Now we're going to chop up the other vegetables that are going to go in the soup, and I'm going to store them in this bowl. That way they won't be sitting on the countertop. And I'm going to make these the celery's about 1/8 to 1/4 inch thick. You don't want to make them too thin, or they'll just vanish into the broth, never to be seen again. And here's our zucchinis. What I like to do is cut the ends off. And then I like to slice it right up the middle. That way you can eat them off of a spoon instead of having to slice into them. These I like to make about 1/4 inch thick because the zucchini tends to cook down and get soft, which actually isn't a bad thing. I can't honestly say that the zucchini is a crunchy ingredient in the soup. It sort of adds texture and taste, and it shows up here and there, but it's really not something that I worry about being, very distinct. I don't think crunchy zucchini in a soup is all that delicious. So let's get these sliced up. And here comes our scallions. And these two can be sliced at about 1/4 inch, 1/8 to 1/4 inch. And we'll use the whole thing. Boy, do these add flavor. Yum. Okay, I set the vegetables aside. Now the chicken we're going to add just about last with the noodles. The reason for that is that the chicken will tend to fall apart if it's boiled too hard for too long. And what I like to do with the chicken is just cut it into smaller pieces. I don't worry about making them perfect cubes by any means. I actually think that the unusual shapes are more delicious and add a texture, and it's just a very different experience than a lot of the store-bought soups. So I try to give it that sort of, I guess you'd say the homemade feel. So I'm just cutting it into pieces. And the reason I do this is just to make them smaller pieces, but knowing that the soup itself is going to break it up a little bit more, I don't make the pieces too small. I also am careful about not cutting the chicken on the same cutting board that I cut vegetables. You really should not mix meat on the same cutting board with vegetables at any point. You should have a separate cutting board or a separate surface for meat. That helps to prevent any kind of cross-contamination. So just give it a nice cut. But don't be too exacting. Don't worry about if it's not perfect cubes. Sort of the more unusual shapes tend to capture more of the broth and more of the native flavor of the soup. Let me just look down and make sure that I got all the really large pieces. And again, with the meat, it's how much you want to add. Literally, you could add no meat at all and still have a pretty tasty chicken broth vegetable soup. And you could use the meat for, sandwiches and other dishes, maybe cacciatore. But most people, if you're going to promise them a chicken soup, they want to have chicken in it. And even though this is a vegetable-rich chicken soup, the chicken certainly plays a flavor role. Here we have the carrots cooking in the chicken soup with the onions. The onions are really cooking down. The carrots are getting nice and soft. And what we're going to do is add our vegetable mix. And again, be really careful when you do this. You don't want to get splashed by the broth. If you're uncomfortable, there we go. There's an example. If you're uncomfortable with it, do what I'm doing now. Just lower these vegetables down in using a spoon. And you can do this with all the ingredients. Now, if you're making this soup and you find that you're getting really close to the top with the broth, you can take some of the broth and use a ladle, take it out of there and put it in another container. And you have a choice with it. You can either freeze it for other dishes that you may want to make. There's nothing like making other soups, other dishes, using broth that you made yourself instead of store-bought broth. It just tastes that much better. So sometimes you may get very close to the top, and that's when it's time to take a ladle and spoon some of it out. Now I'm going to cover that and let it cook for about another 5 minutes, and then we'll add the noodles and the meat. Now the vegetables have been brought back to a boil. They've boiled sort of a slow boil for about 5 minutes, and now we're ready to add the chicken and the noodles. Now what we're going to do at this point is, again, slowly lower the chicken into the mix. After the last splash incident, we're going to take it easy. So we're just going to scoop out the chicken and put it right into the soup. I try to use mainly the white meat chicken because it does tend to be a lot less fatty, so it doesn't add fat back into the soup, and it also tends to be tastier. So here goes our white meat chicken. And also from an oven stuff or roaster, there's an awful lot of white meat chicken. You won't need any more chicken than this. So there's the chicken. Now here's where I'm going to ask you to practice restraint. This is the point where we're going to add the noodles. The point here again is if you add too much of the noodles, then I guarantee you the next morning you're going to get up and you're going to have pretty much a pot full of ramen noodles. So what you want to do is take, I'd say about 2 handfuls. That's probably equal, depending on the size of your hand, to about 1.5 cups of noodles. I try not to overdo it. I can always add more noodles the next time I eat it. I can never the next day take the noodles out if they drank all the broth. So I would say 2 handfuls of noodles and leave it at that. You bring the mix back to a boil and you cook it for the recommended amount of time on your bag of noodles. And by the time you're done with that, you will have a chicken soup. So let's bring it back up to a boil and let's see how long these noodles take. These noodles take 10 to 12 minutes and they cook uncovered. So I would say in 10 minutes we'll have our chicken soup. But you say, not so fast. There is one other serious question that needs to be considered, and that is salt. How much sodium can you safely add to this chicken soup? Now the reason I like to make my own chicken soup in part is that it gives me more control over the sodium content. So what I'll usually do is I'll start out by just adding about 1 tablespoon of salt. And when you consider how many servings you'll get out of this soup, that's really not a tremendous amount of salt. If you like yours saltier, what I really recommend is let the soup finish and then see if you need to add any more salt. Another option is to let people salt the soup themselves when they eat it. That gives them total control over how much salt they're going to consume. Another point I want to make is that if by any chance the chicken that you had wasn't the most flavorful chicken in the world, and it does happen, then what you may want to do, and some people would say it's cheating, is you may want to add a bouillon cube or 2, a chicken bouillon cube or 2, and that will amp up the chicken flavor a little bit. That may be important to people who actually do like the taste of store-bought soups. It will make it taste a little bit more familiar to them, and hopefully you can gradually wean them off of that preference. So here you have it, delicious, nutritious chicken soup that you made with your own hands. It's chicken soup, it's vegetable rich, the broth is delicious, there's not a lot of fat in it. As long as you took it easy on the salt, there's not a lot of sodium in it either. If you want to make this recipe, please go to seniors.com. That's seniors.com, but with an X instead of an S. So that's seniors.com. Go to our site, put in the words chicken soup in the search window, and you'll get the recipe for the 2-day version and the quick and easy version of this chicken soup. The other thing I'd like you to do is check out my new book, Fit Body, Fit Mind, Your Practical Guide to Aging Well. That book has a lot of other recipes that are delicious, nutritious, and vegetable rich. And they're also low fat and low sodium. So again, the book is Fit Body, Fit Mind, Your Practical Guide to Aging Well, and you'll find it on Amazon.com. So I look forward to seeing you when we make our next dish.